welcome back to episode 12. 12. I am the Turn.
I'm the Bark.
And we're still going to be here a long time. As you notice behind Mr. Barker, we have our screen. This is for content. So this is for our students to learn. And we're going to talk about what would be sections 3 and 4 of lesson 11. We're going to talk about two really famous people. In fact, so famous, they get a whole play written about one of them, but the other one is in there for most of the second act. He's in there for the second act. So, and that is Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson.
So, I'm going to talk about Jefferson. Mr. Turner's going to talk about that other guy who often gets forgotten in history because he died younger than everybody else. So, Thomas Jefferson was born to a wealthy plantation-owning family in Virginia. He's one of 10 kids.
Oh.
Yeah. Woof. And he's the one that gets to inherit everything. It's documented that he was always very curious, very, very education-minded. We mentioned in our last video he was the one that said that we should have schools, even though he was probably educated by a tutor in their home. From a powerful family, educated, he's a southern gentleman. You know, he's from a good family, wealthy family, has everything going in the right direction, attends college, he knows Greek, he knows Latin. He's a very gifted writer, not really known for being much of a public speaker. He inherits land from his father's estate and eventually, builds his own place. A little place called Monticello. Hello. So where he lives the rest of his life with his wife and then some other people later we'll talk about. But you remember from class when we watched the John Adams and we were getting close to the Declaration of Independence, John Adams goes, "This is what we need to do." And he goes to Thomas Jefferson and he's like, "But you need to write it. 1, because you're really good at writing, and 2, because everybody hates me."
Yep.
It's kind of the story of John. I think that should be like the tagline on a John Adams biography. Everybody hates me.
I mean, it's true. Like, everybody did hate him, but that was kind of that was what he was almost going for, was that he wanted to be so outspoken. And you hear Thomas Jefferson is, he gives that famous quote in the documentary where he says, I'd give all my money to sink the island of Great Britain into the sea. And Adams is like, holy crap, like I didn't know you were that passionate, and he goes, and Thomas Jefferson's character, or the guy who plays Thomas Jefferson, says, I have no gift for the oratory, or no gift for public speaking. And that's true. Jefferson is much better at writing his thoughts than he's speaking. There's proven cases of him arguing in either the cabinet, Washington's cabinet, or, on the floor of the House or anything like that. And he has these long-winded, rambling speeches, and they're going everywhere because he is that thinker. His whole mind is, he wants to grab onto a concept and really explore it before doing any action. So opposite of Jefferson is Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton is the exact opposite birth of Jefferson. Hamilton is born his birth is actually kind of shrouded in mystery. There's not a lot of documentation on it. But he's born, the estimates are like 1755 to 1757, but he's basically born in St. Croix in one of the Virgin Islands, and he kind of like starts to build a life, but his family's wealth is actually pretty decimated. Because his mother marries somebody who is like a much older gentleman, doesn't work out, so they run away. Her mother and run away to back to St. Croix, where they'll have their own area. But Alexander Hamilton gets his tag of being a illegitimate son of a Scottish trader. And so he has to kind of work his way up to try and build his life. And again, that's what the inspiration behind the Lin-Manuel Miranda musical is that this guy was literally the American dream, came from nothing and built himself up. So he actually gets, his mother passes away when he's younger. he gets a job working for the landlord, and he's actually trading all these commodities, and then the song goes, he's, trading rum and sugar cane and all the things he can't afford. And basically builds it, and people start to realize, oh man, this kid's got a gift. Like, we can't leave him on these islands. We have to, bring him somewhere. And so I think it's a preacher, because it's not a Catholic priest, but it's another person a man of the cloth, as you will, basically realizes his importance and sends him to New York, like raises money, sends him to New York to actually go and study at King's College, because they know like he can go much further than what he does. So Hamilton is constantly trying to prove himself, because he doesn't have the background. Like, if he walks up and says, I'm, Alexander Hamilton, the son of, such and such, that doesn't carry any weight. Whereas Jefferson can say in Virginia, I'm Thomas Jefferson, I'm the son of this. And people are like, oh, okay, yeah, I know that guy. I've heard of that guy. It carries that prestige. So Hamilton's constantly chasing that prestige. And we'll see that as he gets to make some decisions in the new government.
Yeah, and the thing that sets him apart when he's on St. Croix is that there was a hurricane, and he writes an account of how the hurricane decimated the island. There's only like 2 major towns on the island today. It's not a very big place. No. But people see, again, somebody recognizes his gift, they raise money, and they send him off to New York. And he arrives in New York like right before the Revolutionary War kind of kicks off and gets going, and he'll get swept up into that and ends up being the right-hand man to George Washington, which in Hamilton, there's a song all about that. So the next thing we're talking about is kind of their view of like human nature is how the textbook puts it, but it's almost like a philosophy on like how do they view other people, or like how do people operate, and it informs how they treat government. So Jefferson thinks that any informed citizen can make good decisions as long as they're like civic minded. Like, there's going to be people who are going to be able to make good choices for the sake of like everybody, kind of like a utilitarian person. Like, I'm going to think about what's good for everybody, not what's good for myself. And he said that there was goodness and wisdom in being like a farmer or a planter, which is kind of ironic because Jefferson being a plantation owner, in the same way that Washington was a plantation owner, like if you own a plantation, you're not actually doing a lot of the planting, which will come up in the first cabinet battle.
Right. We know who's really doing the planting.
Right. And we'll talk about that when we get into talking about economic views here in a little bit. But you know what I mean? But Jefferson really has a soft spot in his heart for farmers. He just thinks that like being farmer or being agrarian is like a very noble thing. And again, he envisioned the United States as being a sprawling country of small farms. He didn't think that there was going to be these big industrial cities like there was in England in America. He thought it was going to stay small, sparsely populated. It was going to be a new thing. It wasn't going to follow the same formula that Britain had kind of followed.
And so, again, what's interesting, so a lot of this talk, we're going to talk about these polar opposites, and really important to point out, these two will be titans of politics and dictate where the country will go well into like 1800. And so they will play a huge role in that. Hamilton and many Federalists share the same viewpoint. Hamilton has a viewpoint that he sees in the war that humans are naturally selfish. They will go for what they need and only have their own private interests at heart. And so, again, a kind of an opposite and a more negative viewpoint from what Jefferson has. So Hamilton says, okay, we need a strong we need like a system that can protect us from the mob, because the mob isn't out to think about everybody. Everybody in the mob is thinking about themselves and what they can get from it. And that's kind of his mentality. Is like, oh, okay, so we can't, kind of trust the idea that we want the common person to make these decisions, because that's not going to work. They're only going to be worried about what they want. and that is going to be something that is not going to help the new country as a whole. So that's kind of Hamilton's view on human nature. Again, Jefferson views it as everyone looks out for everybody. Hamilton is like, no, people only look out for themselves and keep that selfishness as a part of it. They're trying to achieve something.
Yeah, so then with that kind of leads itself into government. And so Hamilton's going to become, as Mr. Turner said, associated with the Federalist Party, which Washington will also be a member of the Federalist Party, which is odd because he's actually a Southern planter. He's actually a farmer from Virginia, just like Jefferson. And then Jefferson is going to be one of the linchpins of the Democratic Republicans. In the book, I think they just go down and refer to them as Republicans.
Yeah.
So they were afraid that this idea where they said only the best people in America can help run America felt a lot like an aristocracy or an upper class, like Europe, like France or like Britain. And they would often call the Federalists monarchists, saying that they wanted the president to have too much power and make him like a king. So on the flip side of that, Jefferson was really about the best federal government is a small federal government with very limited powers. And the Democratic Republicans pushed an interpretation of what's called a strict construction of the Constitution, where the Constitution, it's literally, you can only do what the Constitution tells you can do, which when Jefferson becomes president gets blown up in a court case. So where the Supreme Court essentially gives itself a power that's not listed in the Constitution, but they tried.
Yep. So Hamilton's going to have, like we just talked about, Barker brought up a really good point, that the aristocracy, again, people in the Federalist Party, so I know we're talking about Hamilton, but John Jay, who will be a huge Federalist and will run the court for years, the Supreme Court, he's the first Chief Justice, and he'll run it for a long, long time. He's actually quoted as saying that, and this is from the book, that those who own the country ought to govern it. And so again, they do have this mindset that if you have the money, if you have the time and the education, you should be running the country, right? We're not going to get some yeoman farmer, right, like the basic guy, to come in and make these huge decisions that run the country. And this stems, so Hamilton wants a strong federal government, if you haven't picked up on that. He wants the government to run everything because he thinks what it does is it solves all our issues as states that are arguing with each other. Remember, Hamilton comes from the Caribbean, and so there's no loyalty to any state. He's not like, I'm a Virginian, right? Like Washington says, or Jefferson says. He's like, yeah, I landed in New York. That's great. I like New York, but my country is America. And this is actually one of the things that comes out of the Revolution is that, the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence and stuff like that, they wanted, and in the Articles of Confederation even, they were like, oh, I'm looking out for my state. Like, I want my state to be safe. But the people who fought in the Revolution come out as saying, like, you told me I'm fighting for this country called America. Like, these states shouldn't be arguing with each other. We're one country now. Like, that's what I fought for. I have no allegiance to New York because I fought with Virginians, Rhode Islanders, Connecticut people, like stuff like that. So it doesn't matter. So Hamilton wants a strong federal government. He wants the government to have a lot of control and the states have less. And he wants the people who are rich and powerful to run it. Like he views it as, if you have the time to get educated, you can run this country, right? And that's his big thing. The states' individual rights aren't as important as the whole country getting along, because again, by uniting, that's what helped defeat the British. It wasn't like, oh, we all individually fought them and won, right? And again, if you paid attention, you know that France played a huge role, bigger than any role. Like, we survived, that's it. And then France helped clear everything else out. So again, Hamilton, strong federal government. Jefferson, strong state government. So strong federal government under the Federalists, right? Federal government, easy to remember. And then Democratic Republicans want a strong state government, less powerful. They see it more as an allegiance of states. Hamilton sees it as a binding contract.
Yeah. And so let's move on to the economy. Again, this is not a whole lot of new information. Jefferson again pushes for an agrarian-based economy, where we produce raw materials. So like we're farming tobacco, farming wheat, farming, you know, cotton. I think cotton hasn't come about yet, but I think I was listening to a presentation from Gilder Lerman today. They said that at Monticello they had 20 different varieties of peas that Jefferson grew. You know, so this idea that we should be farmers, we're going to make our, and if you look at numbers, interesting side note here, the percentage of America that were farmers or lived outside of cities was a huge portion of the U.S. population early on. And then as we begin to shift into more of an industrial economy, those numbers start to change. Where like today, if you look at the percentage of the population that farms in the United States, it's extremely small. And the farms that a lot of them are farming are extremely large, where it was the exact opposite at the beginning of the country, where there was a lot of farmers, an immense number of farmers that were generally farming a small amount of land. And it's interesting that Jefferson chooses that as the identity that he wants to kind of identify with, because it's kind of a whimsical fantasy compared to what his actual farm lifestyle is. But one of the things that he picks up from them is that farmers aren't necessarily big fans of banks. They don't like what's called speculation, where people loan money to somebody else or like give somebody a coupon, a share, a bond from the government that says the government's going to give you this, you give the government money now and then we'll pay you back later. Well, you're sitting there with that coupon, that bond, right, to get money back later, but you need to eat today. So you end up selling that bond that's worth, let's say $100 for $50 to somebody else who's got more cash on hand. And then that guy can turn in your bond that he bought for $50 for $125, making, $50 more profit than you should have made if you would have just held on to it. And that comes up again in the cabinet battle. He talks about, because one of the big things is like, how do we deal with the debt of the war? Because everybody wants to win the war. Everybody hates Britain. We want to be free, Viva America. And then when it's over, somebody's like, well, here's the bill, y'all. Everybody wants to eat, but nobody wants to pay. And so all the states are just looking around like, well, that's really not my bill. I mean, that's the country's bill. That's not mine, man. And so the line from the song is Jefferson shows up and says, if New York is in debt, why should Virginia bear it? Right? It's your problem. It's not ours. Like, you just, what is it? Oh man, it's like something like in Virginia, it's like we plant, we create, we put.
You just want to move our money around.
In Virginia, you just want to move our money around, make money off of us.
Yep, you just want to move our money around.
And so that's kind of one of the resentments of the more agrarian South and what will become the West, because the people that are moving west aren't going to be bankers. They're going to be farmers, because there's nothing else out there and you have to farm so you have food. So, I mean, like that mentality and that resentment is going to kind of grow out of this idea that the South is more agrarian and the North is going to go a different direction with their economy. That's kind of hard because it's kind of set up in this other way. But, that's really where Jefferson is with it. It's like it should be about, it's kind of this idea that like I can show you how I made my money. I can give you the product. I can show you what I grew out of the ground. Right. Here it is. Yeah. And you go back all the way back to like Shays' Rebellion, right? Where it was all about farmers getting foreclosed on after the Revolution. This has been a consistent concern for the small farmer in America, is that just like farmers today, still, you have to take a loan out from the bank to pay for all your stuff for the year. And you get to sell all of your products or most of your products one time a year. And you have to hope that you have a good crop. People want to buy it, so you can make money and pay that loan off so you can take the next one out. Yeah. Like potato farmers in Grant County now are a little worried because demand for potatoes right now
is dropping.
According to some news reports, it's dropping because a lot of restaurants aren't serving potatoes right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and you lead up with a good point where you talked about the bond thing, which is going to lead into my thing. So Hamilton's view of the economy is, again, flip opposite of Jefferson. He views it as like, we're going to build this industrial nation. We're going to build this strong economy that's going to be, we're going to expand our nation's business. People are going to want to import our goods. And so he's trying to create all these different things where so Hamilton, if you didn't know, if you didn't pay attention to our last video, he becomes the Secretary of the Treasury. So he's in charge of all finances in the United States. Like, that's his job, that's his role. And so he has a couple of big visions. And Barker mentioned something already. He mentioned strict construction of the Constitution, which is where if the Constitution says it, you can do it. If it doesn't say it, you can't do it. Hamilton flip-flops that. He thinks the Constitution is open for interpretation, which is what we call a loose construction. So he views it as, if the Constitution doesn't say you can't, then you can. And what this will lead to is this is going to lead to a battle over what we call the Bank of the United States. Hamilton viewed it as this was an absolute necessity to get our economy running. And Hamilton, again, is one of those characters that drops out of history because he died so young. And we'll get to his death at the end of this presentation. But he actually, the end of the last song of Hamilton, when they're going over quotes from the people who served with him, James Madison is quoted as saying he doesn't get enough credit for the credit that he gave us, because Hamilton establishes the national bank and absorbs all the debts. Like Mr. Barker said, he said, if New York's in debt, why should Virginia bear it? Hamilton negotiated so that every state debt would fall back into the United States pot, which again, you're talking around 22 million in their time period. So, we're talking probably billions of dollars today. And he absorbed it, and it was this famous negotiation. It's one of my favorite songs from the musical, The Room Where It Happened. And there was a dinner party basically between Jefferson, Hamilton, and a couple other people where they pounded out a deal that got Hamilton the national bank. He got him the votes for the national bank, and it got him the votes for absorbing the debt crisis. And what happened was, in return, the South got the nation's capital, and Virginia specifically. Obviously, Hamilton got the way better deal when it comes to this, because we have Washington, D.C. now, and no state should be given the honor of holding the nation's capital. So that's why it's called D.C., the District of Columbia. It's actually not in a state. It's its own entity. But again, Hamilton continues this, and his thought is that they want to buy up these debts. Well, one of the things, like Mr. Barker said, was you had these bonds that people had bought in the war, and they basically become useless under the Articles of Confederation. But when people in the North find out that Hamilton's going to consolidate the debt and the government will be good on its money, they go buy these bonds from the West and the South for a fraction of the cost and turn to stand a big profit. Well, when Southerners hear about this and Westerners hear about this, this is the start of that distrust between and what we call sectionalism of the United States, where they start to break off and to have their own opinions. And the three regions we'll have are the North, the West, and the South. And that'll play a big role in politics and our history for, what would make an argument through probably like the Civil War. Yeah. Yeah. So, and again, the debt basically gets consolidated. Hamilton gets his bank. And again, the bank is it's a kind of an interesting topic, but it's not a super interesting topic, so I'll just cover it really quick. Basically what it is the bank is its own private entity, but the United States government owns the majority of the shares. To explain stock really quick, if a company puts out shares, whoever owns the most or a majority of them gets to help make the decisions. And so the United States government would dictate the decisions. Money could be loaned out. The United States could store its money there. And again, we could have a debt program, and people would see that we're paying off their debts. And so going back to Hamilton's vision, where we could pull money, we could take loans from other states, and they would know we would be good for them, because we wouldn't just have this agrarian economy. We'd have a manufacturing where we knew we could sell and export. And so that's kind of Hamilton's viewpoint on it.
And a lot of that's credited to him looking at how the Britain had taken over the world. Like, you think about it, an island the size of Alabama dominates the globe. And one of the ways that, again, I was re-listening to some lectures today, one of the professors says that it's essentially about establishing lines of credit, borrowing money from other countries, and you don't have to pay all of it back. All Britain is doing is paying their minimum payments, which is a terrible plan for personal finances. But as a nation, like, it allows you to get a lot more capital, a lot more money to do things with a lot quicker than if you sit there and say, I've got to have the cash in my hand right now, which is the same way that a lot of Americans operate today. Like, if you want to buy a house, very rarely does a person walk up with enough money in hand to go to the bank and say, I want to buy this house. Here's all the money for it. It usually takes somewhere between 15 and 30 years. Yep. Which is, we talk about national debt, and you can look online. It's in the trillions and just keeps getting bigger and bigger each minute. Because it's not really about everybody trying to pay each other back. It's the fact that we all pay each other enough money to keep each other afloat.
Right.
So the last thing we're going to talk about is foreign policy. So Jefferson becomes the first Secretary of State. So his main concern is dealing with foreign countries. And he already comes in with a bit of a bias. He spent the last 5 years before he takes this job living in France as the ambassador to France. He's in France he's in Paris when the revolution starts. When they storm the Bastille, they break in and get all the guns from the government and start taking over. Like, he is living in the city. Like, he sees the beginning of the revolution. And again, the three pillars of the French Revolution are equality, liberty, and brotherhood. Sorry, I was thinking of them in French.
Sorry.
Non parlez-vous français? Non, not oui. But in the beginning, like, Jefferson is very idealistic at this point. He's a very complex character. His mindset shifts as he gets older. He's one of the founding fathers that actually you could argue, becomes more conservative as the older he gets, where a lot of other founding fathers, you could argue, get more liberal as they get older, like Washington, for instance. His views on slavery change. Jefferson's change in an opposite direction to Washington's. So he's a fan of France. He's trying to say, we need to support this other revolution. It's all about the ideas that we are fighting for. They're trying to bring down a monarchy and give democracy, give people the power, which is what we're fighting about. It's very idealistic. And he begins to, like, they start by saying, well, and then the revolution starts to get a little rough. It's not like the American Revolution where everybody neatly bands together and overthrows the government, and the rich people get to be the rich people afterwards, and they establish a new government, and there's kind of an organization to it. It becomes, Hamilton will call it chaos. The Federalists will call it chaos. And they start, executing people. And the French at one point will send over a guy named Edmond Genet, which doesn't look like that when you read it. But he shows up, and he's expecting Washington to, like, give him, like, this big bear hug. Oh, welcome, my revolutionary brother, down with the monarchy. But Washington is a Federalist, and the Federalists, spoiler, are more fans of Britain. And so, and plus, Washington is very good about trying to be neutral. So I think about it again. You're trying to be friends with two different girls, but you don't want to, if you give one of them too much attention, the other one gets mad, and then you lose both of them. So Washington is not as receptive to Genet as Genet expects. And so he actually begins to, like, publicly speak against Washington and says the United States needs to declare war on Britain to show its support of France for what France did for America. And a lot of people in the United States will say, like, I'll let you cover that. But it gets to the point where Jefferson actually distances himself and he says, you're going a little too hard. Like, Genet is, like, a little bit too radical for me. And so he distances himself from that. He actually implores Washington to run for re-election. He says things are starting to get, he can start to feel the political shift happening where people are moving in two different directions. He says, the only person in America that can stop this is you, Washington. So run again in 92. Washington wins, brings everything back together. Jefferson is no longer happy serving inside of the cabinet and will actually leave the cabinet in December of 1793, go back to Monticello and begin, in a sense, trying to campaign for the Democratic Republicans to oppose the Federalists in what was it, 1796.
Yeah. Yeah, and so again, talking about this, so Hamilton, so there's a famous, the election of 1800 song from Hamilton. They're talking about what basically happens, and we'll go into depth to it. But Jefferson says, they call me a Francophile. At least they know I know where France is. And Francophile was a term used to, like, you were pro-France. And Britain, so Hamilton, again, with that manufacturing base, that idea, he's pro-Britain. Right, Britain is where we already have our established trade lines. We already have, our vendors. Basically, like, everything's good to go if we just stick with Great Britain. And so that's where he leans in. And then again, one of the things is Jefferson's almost a little blinded. Like, we talked about this already when we talked about the last video, but Jefferson's a little bit blinded when it comes to how the revolution should take place in terms of France. Like, right, they're chopping people's heads off. And it's just wealthy people. And we're talking thousands of people die, men, women, and children, just for having money. And again, I'm not, that's 6 months away after this. It's just not good. Versus, like Barker said, where one people, like, the rich stay rich in the United States, the poor stay poor. And that's just kind of how it is. And again, that's unique to our revolution. So Hamilton is pro-Britain. Again, he looks at it and says he thinks Britain is the ideal country, the model country of the way it should run. And so he's pro-Britain. I'm trying to remember the point you wanted me to bring up with that, but I'm not remembering off the top of my head. But anyway, when it comes to it, so we're negotiating, we're talking about, like, Hamilton is pushing Washington a little bit to remain neutral, right? Because again, France is asking us to declare war on Great Britain. The other thing is, Washington has a novel right here, where he is smart enough to remain neutral. Because we're at that point in our history, we're not ready. We don't have a huge standing army, standing navy ready to fight. We're weak. We got lucky out of the American Revolution, and we're just trying to build it. And so Hamilton does that with his economy and driving those deals with Great Britain and things like that. That's what he's good at. And that's when our country starts to get on its feet in the economic sense, is when our government becomes more powerful, and we could stand up if we needed to do these types of things. So do you want to go into the end of their lives?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, so I would just say we're going to probably talk about presidencies and stuff like that later in later clips, but
yeah. So do you want me to talk about? Well, do you want to flip it? Because
yeah, let's go ahead and flip it. So sorry, we didn't get a chance to discuss this all the way through, but basically we'll talk about how it ends. So Hamilton is actually crushed politically by a scandal in which he cheated on his wife, and it becomes public knowledge. And it's real bad, and so basically nobody trusts him. He's basically thrown out of politics. His son gets killed in a duel, standing up for his honor, and it goes just really south. But there's one guy that's always been the one that he can handle. And in the election of 1800, like we talked about earlier, Washington's not running. Or sorry, not Washington. Washington's gone. John Adams took the presidency in 96. Jefferson's the vice president. Jefferson runs again. Adams runs again. And a guy named Aaron Burr, a senator from New York, runs again. And what actually happens is John Adams doesn't have enough votes for anything. So it's really an election between Jefferson and Burr, both members of the Democratic Republicans. And Federalists are just locking up the election. There's no majority winner. It goes to the House of Representatives. I think it's voted on like 12 times or something like that with no winner. And basically the Federalists turn to Hamilton, even though he's in obscurity at this point, dealing with the loss of his son and everything like that, and ask him, hey, who do you want us to vote for? And Burr started off as a Federalist and now switched parties to be a Democratic Republican. So Hamilton's kind of irate at that. And the quote from the song is, Jefferson has beliefs, even if I don't agree with them, and Burr has none. And he specifically says, I never agreed with Jefferson once. And we fought on, every single front they fought because they disagreed politically. But anyway, he basically screws Burr out of the presidency. And then a couple years later, Burr runs for governor of New York, and Hamilton gets him there again, saying, no, I won't support this guy. So Burr sees Hamilton as his only obstacle in his achieving something politically. And so he challenges Hamilton to a duel, and they go to Hoboken, New Jersey, because everything's legal in New Jersey. Again, a line from the song. And they duel, and there's some speculation about how the duel went down. And it's thought that the Hamilton thought it was a gentleman's duel. And so basically dueling was for honor. And a gentleman's duel was, neither of us are cowards. We'll stand there and have our guns, but when it's time to shoot, we'll point our gun up in the air and fire. And it's thought that Hamilton pointed his gun up to fire, and Burr drills him through the breastbone. And before he can get back across the Hudson River, he's dead. And so his life ends very suddenly, and there was a lot more of politics that Hamilton could have played in. And so one of the biggest questions is, what would our nation be like if Hamilton had survived and gone on to live the length of life that most of the founding fathers did? However, he did not. So again, a very interesting character, right? Dealing with scandal and things like that. So I'll turn it over to Jefferson.
Well, and he's an outsider as well. Like that cannot be overstated, I guess, enough.
Yeah.
In that time in politics, in the first 50 years of the U.S., pretty much until Andrew Jackson, every president is either a founding father or related to a founding father. Yeah, JQA. Yeah. And so it's really hard for Hamilton. The other thing that people don't realize is those families have money. They can make sure that their story gets told. They can pay somebody to write stuff down. His wife spent a lot of time trying to make sure that he was.
Oh, there were thousands of pages. So I'm reading the documentary. I know you have it too. It's right here. And in the intro. So again, if you really want a good read, I've delved into it. I'm a couple chapters in. It's really interesting. This is the book that Lin-Manuel Miranda got and read on vacation that inspired him to write the musical. And it's really, really good. It's called Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, and he wrote many other ones. But it talks about how his wife, so Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, spent years going and writing and getting the minds that she could find to try and sift through his work, because he was a constant writer. And again, that's that overachieving, right? That trying to rise the social ladder and climb it. And so it's absolutely just fascinating to see what became of it. And what people found really interesting was, as they were doing their study, that Elizabeth Schuyler actually got rid of a lot of her own letters, not him writing her, but her writing him back. She got rid of those, and that was kind of a bummer, when people were doing research. So he's a very interesting character. Jefferson's even more fascinating when it comes to this, but I'll let you go on about that. So
yeah, so I mean, it's really interesting. I think that's part of why he kind of falls into obscurity, is that he doesn't have the social backing. I'm always really kind of critical of why Paul Revere is so prevalent in history, but he was a silversmith. So, yeah. I mean, he obviously had money and had influence. He owned a media company too. Yeah. So he had means to kind of promote his own story above the stories of other people. And history is funny that way, because, it's a jigsaw puzzle, and we only get the pieces. Sometimes people give us a piece that really, they say it's a bigger piece than it really should be.
Right.
And until we kind of come back and change that story and, look at it a different way, we don't realize that it's incorrect. But talking about Jefferson will live a lot longer. He will actually die on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, 1826, on the same day as John Adams. So, who had been friends during the Constitutional Convention or leading up to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitutional Convention, and then later become political opponents. Obviously, they run against each other, but they will kind of rekindle their friendship right before they both pass. Mm-hmm. And so it's really kind of like crazy. Like, what are the odds that two founding fathers like essentially send letters to each other, like apologizing for being on the opposite side of politics with each other and letting that get in the way of their friendship, and then they both pass on the same day. I mean, it's pretty cool. But Jefferson, like I said, Jefferson goes on. He will become president. He by Louisiana, mm-hmm. right, with a presidential power that's not in the Constitution.
Loose construction.
Even though he was a strict constructionist in the beginning, it's everybody's pragmatic. Like, you're kind of, it's you believe one way, but then when it's good for you, it's okay to be loose.
But I mean, and that's what Hamilton viewed, right? Like, Hamilton saw it as that's how people were naturally, right? Like, when it becomes convenient for me, I will do what I need to do.
But I think Jefferson would have argued that he did it for the good of the country, to expand the country. He triples the size of the U.S. Yeah. Because Napoleon needs cash to fight in Europe. So, and Jefferson also kind of like has a scandal. His wife passes away, and then he has a relationship with one of his female slaves, who actually is technically a stepsister of his wife. They share the same father, which could be a reason for the affinity between them, because like he's literally like, she's biologically the sister of his wife. I mean, if you were, that was a person whose personality you enjoyed, you might, there'd be similarities there or whatever. But, Jefferson owns 600 slaves, and near the end of his life, like, he will continually like own slaves and begins to like sell slaves to like maintain his lifestyle. And where like Washington and Martha will end up like releasing all their slaves by the time that they both pass. Martha does it before she passes, because it's kind of awkward when you have hundreds of people that are like waiting for you to die so they can be free. Yeah. You probably start to feel a little uneasy. Yeah. So she let them go early. Jefferson released some slaves. A lot of them were his own children that he'd had with Sally Hemings, and she's actually recognized on like the Monticello website. Like, we've come a long ways in like accepting that that's not a fault of his. That's just, that happened a lot in the South, but like how to put it? Like, it's people have been really uptight about it for a long time, that, well, you can't say anything bad about the founding fathers. Don't talk about the negatives. And it's like, I come from a perspective of that makes them real people. And, like, it's just kind of, how do you square that the same person who wrote that we should get rid of we should get rid of slavery in the Declaration of Independence, and that all men are created equal, owned 600 people until the day he died.
Right.
That's kind of hard to square sometimes, but it's also that, I mean, I don't want to completely just dismiss it by saying the times were different, but like to run a plantation of that size, the expectation of that time was that you were going to own slaves, and that was the way that things would be done. Just right. Like today, if somebody in Grant County owns a if you're going to farm wheat in America, you're going to probably own a combine or rent a combine.
Right.
You're not going to go out and do it with a sickle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a hammer and a sickle.
Well, and you're not going to be, we're not condoning this practice. We're explaining the reasoning why it continued to develop. And the biggest thing with that is that if I go out and I have to pay every single one of my workers, for all the work they do, I'm not going to compete the guy next to me who has the same amount of land, where he buys his slaves for an upfront cost and then just pays for their living, right? Like, he makes sure they have a house, he makes sure they're fed, they're clothed, and that's it, right? And we're talking a clothing allowance of like buying clothes like one time a year, right? Like, so it's not that guy's going to make more profit because his labor costs are lower than mine. So it's one of those ones, it doesn't make it right, but it makes it, if you want to compete, you have to do this practice.
In the same way today, like, why do companies ship their production to third world countries like India or China? Because it's cheaper, and the other companies they're competing with are doing the same thing. And if I try and pay everybody in the United States and have to pay union wages and it becomes a lot harder to be successful until the government intervenes in the economy and gives you a break. But
Yep.
we're kind of beside the point at this point.
Yeah.
But both Jefferson and Hamilton are both two really interesting people. They're both not perfect.
No.
Hamilton, like today, people were like, well, was he narcissistic because he wanted to duel and he always thought women? He would kind of a sucker for women in distress. He always wanted to be the chivalrous one and like step up, and that's part of him like trying to be, I guess, what in the musical they call it new money,
Yeah.
right? Because he's newly rich. He's trying to do what he thinks like an honorable man should do, and like dueling is an honorable thing. Like if somebody says that you're a liar, you challenge them to a duel, and then you have an opportunity to go talk. And if you can like somebody essentially says, yeah, my bad, I shouldn't have said that, I agree, I'm wrong, you don't have to duel.
Right.
But that's not as manly, as macho, as taking the pistols, turning. And again, the reason for firing in the sky is that it shows that you are man enough to load a gun, have the other guy load his gun, turn around, and then fire into the sky, like knowing that other guy, like what happened with his son and with him, they speculate, is that the person you're dueling against actually turns and fires at you when you turn to fire to the sky. So some people would say that he's kind of, that's his own vanity putting him down.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting thing to look at. Great musical. Disney's working on getting it recorded so that we can distribute it and get more people to see it instead of having to pay and go to Broadway. And right now nobody can see it because that's not happening.
Yeah. And so again, this is Jefferson and Hamilton. Really unique guys. Jefferson to me is a oxymoron. He's a human contradiction. He always, like Barker said, like he'll do stuff sometimes, like again, write beautiful poetry about how everyone should be free and own 600 slaves, right? Have a the Constitution says I can do it. And then all of a sudden, the Constitution doesn't say anything about buying Louisiana. All right, well, I'm going to go do it. So he's just interesting. And then Hamilton, again, like took the nation by storm with their Broadway musical. I think they were nominated for like 15 Tony Awards, their opening season, and just an incredible performance. So, yeah, the soundtrack's inappropriate. So make sure that if you're listening to it, like you find it on Spotify or something like that, you find the edited version to drop out a lot of the swear words and things like that. But yeah, interesting topic to talk about. Excited to see what you guys do in this reading. So one of the things coming out tomorrow, or coming out today, I guess, because that's when you watch this video, is a choice grid. So for social studies, we really want you guys to take that. And if you didn't do sections 1 and 2, great. You can do sections 1 and 2 of chapter 11 still. And if you are done, then hey, take on that choice grade. Pick some of those different topics. Especially one of the things we were really proud of is working on that wellness factor, right? Taking care of yourself during this time. It's very confusing. And so we'd love to see like pictures posted and things like that of you doing these activities. It would be fantastic. So, Bark, anything else?
A really good way to sum this up, and I'm going to steal this from one of the professors that I was listening to today, is that our economy today is run very much on Hamilton's ideals, and our government is very much run on Jefferson's ideals. Jefferson was a politician. Hamilton was an economist. Wasn't necessarily a very good politician, but an amazing intellect for the economy. Jefferson has much more of an impact on the way that our government runs. So even though these two guys were politically on opposite ends of the spectrum, both of them have an influence, a drastic influence on where our country is today and why it is the way that it is.
I like that. So, all right. Until next time, I'm Turn.
I'm Bark.
And we're going to be here a long time. Have a good night, everybody, or good afternoon, or good morning, whenever you watch this video.
Stay safe.
And be well.